Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the latest episode of the China Desk Podcast, hosted on thefederalnewswire.com. Invite the audience to please join us if you'd like to watch the videos on YouTube, and also click a subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, Spotify, Google, Apple, wherever you partake of the podcast world. I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk. Joining me today is a friend who's had a ton of experience around the world, but also in a magical little industry known as television. It was there at the start at Fox News Channel, which is where I came to know John at first. But John Moody, former senior vice president at Fox News. Forgive me, John, if I haven't gotten the title exactly right. I find myself at this stage in life, I'm really good if I've remembered my last food order. So sometimes the titles slip through, but it's an honor to have you join the China Desk Podcast. I want to talk a little bit about how you arrived at writing what I consider to be two really interesting books on China, but also the COVID episode. You have the book right here, Of Course They Knew. I love the title. It sort of captures what we dilly-dallied around through a lot of 2020 and 2021, and in latest news on origins or what have you. But John, welcome to the China Desk. Please share a little bit about how you, with your background, how did you come to write a book that really tells an awful lot about China?
Well, Steve, first of all, thanks for having me. Congratulations on the podcast. I know it's going to be a big success. I started to write, Of Course They Knew, because I got mad. I was watching the early days of this pandemic, which I doggone well refused to call COVID, because it started in Wuhan. It was started by the Chinese. They denied having anything to do with it. And then they, surprise, surprise, allowed everybody in Wuhan that wanted to fly internationally to do so. Well, who could be surprised then that the disease spread around the world as fast as a jet plane can get to its destination? And as I watched this and listened to it and listened to the frankly untruthful and incomplete news reporting that the mainstream media was doing, I just realized I had something to say. I had some inside sources for some of the information that I had available. I knew I couldn't write a totally fact-based nonfiction book. I did not have the access to do that. I was not allowed to go to China. I couldn't get any information from Chinese officials. I was basically being shut out. And so I resorted to, surprise, surprise, social media. A lot of people don't know, you probably do, but there are hundreds of English language websites and chat rooms in China. And if you know how to get into them, if you're invited into one of them, you can learn an extraordinary amount of stuff from them. Now, this happens to be Chinese people who speak English, but there are tens of millions of them who do. The Chinese people are incredibly intelligent, and they've learned that English is one source toward the truth. A lot more than just speaking Mandarin to each other, because that's always controlled by the party anyway. So I started looking at these English language websites. I started looking at English language publications that are available to anybody that wants to research them. And I realized that the official narrative from Beijing was a load of baloney, that people in Wuhan, where the thing started, knew what had happened. They knew that there had been something wrong going on at their virological institute in Wuhan. It's a 7-story building on the edge of town. Everybody knows that virology institute is not very well run and is not very well maintained. And so once you start to follow the chatter going back and forth between people, and they don't have official titles, they're not high-ranking party members, they're just people that live there and know what's going on in their own town. And so that's how I got started with it. And from there on, it was, I won't say a slippery slope, but it sure did right itself.
Well, it wrote itself really well. You do seem to break a few rules of publishing. I mean, this is written a little bit like it was a self-publish. It kind of comes through. There's a little bit raw in places. It might be a little spicy for some people's takes, but I just found it to be very gripping and vivid in going through. But what really, really struck me is that, well, number one, the greatest encryption that the Chinese people and Chinese government have is language. And in some ways, we think of them as a security state, but a lot of people know a lot of things. And if they're willing to speak in English, you can actually access quite a bit. And as someone who came out of the intelligence services, we used to have things that were highly classified, but were not necessarily better quality information than what was open source if people would just go look. So frankly, when I took a dive into the book, I was surprised at how true a lot of this rang to me. As someone who is allegedly an expert and would look at things in Chinese and supposedly knew something about the political structure. But you got right at the nub of the origins, but also how the party state operates. And to me, maybe it's because I was a wonk in those areas, that it was a really fascinating tale going from how some kind of a wretched beast would be discarded from a research lab, and that the people who live around that might surreptitiously or accidentally end up with this animal. That quality control is not something the CCP government is known for, and they don't necessarily give two hoots about the health and welfare of their own people. So, of course, someone could take a toxic animal from a research site, sell it to a guy that makes soup out of it. And anybody who's been in rural China knows that they'll make soup or a meal out of anything that moves. And then off you go from there. But I was just amazed that I jumped right into a fictional tale that probably dialed into among the most plausible origin stories. So just taking that little snippet of where you launch on this narrative, what have you found the reaction to be? I mean, you've lived through, like the rest of us did, the years of dancing on the head of a pin of, was it a lab? Was it an accident? Was it an animal we've never heard of? What have you taken in terms of the reaction to your version of the origin story?
Well, since I worked for Fox News for more than 20 years, I'm used to being called a right-wing reactionary. So that's nothing new. I will say this: I had a publisher who believed in me. He believed in the story, and he gave me a lot of support and encouragement as I was moving along with it. I knew that something weird had happened in Wuhan. The whole world knew that something weird had happened. But as soon as it began to be called the Wuhan pandemic or the Chinese flu, of course, the Communist Party of China approached the WHO, the World Health Organization, and let's make no bones about it, China pretty much controls the WHO. And so they said to these high and mighty health experts, and by the way, experts is just a word that drives me crazy these days. They said to the WHO, you can't call it the China flu. You can't call it the Wuhan virus. We want you to think of some kind of generic name that doesn't mean anything. Well, the WHO has never been short of ideas for things that don't mean anything. And so they immediately said, well, how about COVID? Now, that's a contraction of the longer name of the virus, which nobody knows anyhow. But so suddenly the WHO said, call it COVID. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Washington, said, yes, sir, we'll call it COVID. And then they told all the news networks and all the mainstream media, call it COVID. And by the time the news cycle had changed, we were all calling it COVID. Well, why? Because the Chinese wanted us to? Since when do they make those calls for Americans? And so that, as I said, I started out the book because I was mad, and this just made me madder. The complete control that China has exerted over the narrative of this pandemic is disgusting.
Well, it's political warfare, which is essentially the number one and maybe only real business of the Communist Party. They practice it ruthlessly and at all times. And a lot of people just seem to just let it soak in and just ride with it. The WHO clearly was manipulated, and there are grave consequences. But there's another part of your life that someone just picking up this book may or may not know, and you bring out in this, and that is your experience in Italy. And so, I mean, I was really blown away with sort of the vivid character defining process of the actors in China, and I want to talk a little bit about that, and also sort of the dopey American that gets sucked into all of this, that becomes the useful idiot. And I wish there was only one useful idiot in this world and in this U.S.-China relationship, but you really captured that one too. But you had some really vivid character development on the Italy side of this too. And I think a lot of the world might forget that that was one of the areas really early hard hit in all of this. I mean, really quickly, this became a political football in America, and people thought it was all about Donald Trump. And so, I mean, really, people blast past that when the Chinese shut down domestic travel and let things go out to the world, one of the places it went immediately and ravaged was Italy. But you captured some of that too.
Right. Well, yeah, Steve, and of course you've read into that very well. I was lucky enough to be the Rome bureau chief for Time magazine quite a few years ago, and that allowed me to travel around one of the most beautiful countries in the world, including northern Italy, Lombardy, Tuscany, that area of Italy, which, you know, some people who think of Italy and they think pizza pies and spaghetti. Italy is also a powerful industrial nation, and especially in the north. And I think that we have to acknowledge that the northern regions of Italy have a little bit more German influence in them than, say, Sardinia or Sicily. And there's a good work ethic. And they created some enormously powerful and potent and profitable products there. Just think of the fashion industry that is located around Lake Como. Think of Fiat, the car company, before it was sold. A massive player in the auto industry. Well, when things got tough in the 1990s and toward the beginning of the new millennium, the Italian government, and of course we have to decide which Italian government we're talking about. They usually only last 2.5 days. Decided that they would allow the sale of some of Italy's trademark properties, and they put them up for sale because they needed some money. And there were Chinese buyers waiting at the door in line to buy some of these well-known, established names. And when the Chinese come into a country to take over some of your businesses, they bring Chinese workers in with them. They send in thousands of workers into the country where they're buying, and suddenly that's their workforce. And why is that? Well, not because the Chinese are necessarily more qualified to, let's say, make cars or make wool jackets or ties. In fact, they're not qualified to do that. But it's because the Chinese party can control them. They might be living in Italy doing a job at what used to be an Italian factory, but the party always says to them, now, you know, we know your parents still live in such and such a street, or we know that your sister wants to go to university in the United States. You wouldn't want to do anything that would cause us to think badly of them, would you? And that's how they control their expatriate community. They also sent, at the beginning of this pandemic, around 2019, they had sent people in to a place called Prato. Prato is not too far from Florence. It was at one time one of the leading clothing centers in Italy. And suddenly, well, not suddenly, but over the years, Prato went from a very proud community that made fine linens, that made fine wool goods, they made excellent menswear and ladies' wear, to a town that was dominated by a Chinese immigrant population. Stores then immediately put up Chinese language signs in the windows. Restaurants that had been there for generations became Chinese restaurants. And the quality of these goods largely deteriorated because they were being made or mismade by Chinese labor. There was one famous incident where an entire line of men's clothing had a little sign in the pocket, a little tag, just like we all know, that said "Made in Ility." They had misspelled it, and thousands of garments went out with this label in them. Nobody noticed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I knew some people up north. I stayed in touch with them. I think it was a bit of a surprise to the world at large that northern Italy was the most hard hit, but it's because they don't know about the Chinese invasion of northern Italy. It took
Yeah.
quite a while for the pandemic to reach the southern parts of Italy, the Mezzogiorno, because it doesn't have a large Chinese immigrant population. The north did. The North spread the disease all through Italy, and mostly it spread it through its Chinese immigrant population.
Mhm. Well, it really hits on a number of issues that, again, someone picking up a book thinking that they might be reading about COVID might not necessarily know that they're about to take this journey that addresses something like what the Chinese Communist Party's economic mercantilist model is. There's a sort of a competition for influence around the world, and sometimes America and entrepreneurs excel at it, and other times it's the authoritarians that come in with what seems like a good deal. You buy off a few politicians, you undercut competitors, and then you take control. It's kind of what's happening with food industry in the United States in a certain extent. That's another conversation. But here, you hit at kind of what that economic model is, whether it gets folded into what people talk of as the Belt and Road. But there's this effort that exports Chinese capital and manufacturing under the guise that it's going to help share wealth and prosperity with other friends around the world. But there's all these deleterious effects. Now, you bring it into stark relief in the context of the pandemic. But as you just said, a lot of this was happening prior, and basically the pandemic put some kerosene onto that. And brought things out. But there's also this ethnic tension, and the Communist Party tries to play that to its advantage. Of course, it uses ethnically Chinese people as their pawns, and that is a gross form of racism. And yet it tries to use ethnicity as a shield too. You can't criticize us for COVID or you're racist. And you really captured the flames of that ethnic fire that blew up in the wake too, as Italians of different political stripes started to react to the economic and health consequences of this. Talk a little bit about that part of this narrative.
Well, yes, Steve. Again, you've hit it right on the head. Unfortunately, Americans know breathtakingly little about China. They know that they can get a cheaper pair of socks for 25 cents less. They know that they can get, a cheap electronic device. They know that that's where their Apple Watch comes from. And they know that they might like chop suey. And that's the extent of most people's knowledge of China. This is the second largest economy in the world. It is certainly our greatest competitor now, both politically and economically. And we've just decided, yeah, you know what, we'll let the politicians worry about that. I'm just not going to. I got stuff to do, and I have a sitcom I have to watch tonight. China, to its great credit, has forced its younger generations, and let's include that means people of our generation and then younger. It has forced them to learn about America, much the way the Soviet Union did when that was still in existence. Kids were required to take courses in American history. I can remember from my time in Moscow, there were kids that said, "Oh yeah, we can recite every American president in order. Can you?" Oh, same thing in China. And so China knows what buttons to push to get Americans on edge, to get them defensive, to get them to give a little in order not to be called racist. and they do it with regularity and with great success. So we have to be aware that whenever you get called racist by the Chinese Communist Party, it's sort of a backhanded compliment.
Yeah.
They're just doing what comes naturally to them. That's what they've learned over the years, and the only answer to that charge is to say, really, and how are you treating the Uyghur minority, by the way, in your country? Well, they don't want to talk about. Well, that's they're terrorists, and we have to do something. We had to be kind of tough with them on this. No, you're committing genocide. You're trying to erase an entire part of your population. You, dear China, are the racists. So that's the way to handle that. But it's absolutely true that China knows more about the United States than vice versa, and it uses it to its political advantage.
Absolutely. So let's go back to China. And my contention that this is one of the rare books I've come across where, in character development, an author who makes no claim to having come out of the professorial class or the intelligence community or having spent many long years traveling the countryside of China is developing characters who kind of soullessly go to work at a lab, soullessly work at a dirty food market. And most people are not going to have the great blessing or curse of going into one of these overwhelmingly smelling food markets in their lives and seeing the wild stuff that's up there, but also the soulless partisan political apparatchik that goes into a business or an organization. You have the clash of the security services and those that are involved in propaganda and United Front work coming together. Talk a little bit about how you developed those storylines and those characters where you've got people, like I say, who are the technocrats, the innocent bystanders, and sort of the low class people of China who are the largest subset of the Chinese population. You've got some leadership dynamics where you're talking about the leader of China beaming in by hologram to sort of give instructions. I love that image because whether it's true in the reality sense, it's definitely true in how they beam in and kind of exercise influence. But talk a little bit about how you developed those kind of characters for telling this narrative.
Well, again, Steve, I mean, it's all out there available. I had to make up the names of the characters, but we know who we're talking about. And whether it is, as you say, a lowly menial worker who's being underpaid, and by the way, that's my contention that there was someone at the virology lab in Wuhan who was being mistreated, underpaid, had no chance for advancement, and she got mad and she took a dead bat that had been experimented on and she sold it for money, not for vengeance, for money. And so that's that level. There's the climbing, aspiring party hack that would do anything to get one more advancement up in the career ladder that he or she wants to achieve. And then there are the people that are already pretty well established in the party who are jealously guarding their positions, guarding their power, and always on the lookout for a possible opponent or someone who might be competing with them for the next level of power. All of these people are real people, and that is how life is lived in China now. I've been asked several times now on this when I was going out and talking about this book, is China a communist country? No. China is an information society, and it is run by the Communist Party, but the Communist Party is no more communist than it is democratic or Republican. It's a party that wants to completely control the lives, first of all, of its citizens, and it's coming very close to achieving that, just through overall monitoring, through visual, through the many photos that are taken of Chinese people, the CCTV cameras that are always on when you're crossing the street. And as you know, it's now reached the point where if you're just crossing the street in China, you're on television, whether you know it or not. And what they're doing is not just looking at your face, but they're looking into your eyes. They're looking into your pupils. to see what you might be thinking. You might be having an impure thought. You might even be questioning the party. It's that stage now. It's at that ground level stage of getting into your life and taking it over and making sure that you're a loyal party hack that is keeping China alive and going. And everybody's afraid of it, and nobody knows how to stop it.
Well, it's a absolutely chilling and dire diagnosis with which I can't disagree at all. And it is, I think, one of the scarier human experiments in world history. And given the scale and scope of what China is and the tentacles it has out into the world, it should be chilling for everybody. But that's another part of where you go in this narrative. There is an element where there's a sense of opportunism, bureaucratically, but then nationally, where someone is bringing up, this is what has happened, and a la the Rahm Emanuel throwaway line of never letting a crisis go to waste. What can we do with this? How can we use this against the Americans? How could we use this to our advantage? And that very early in this process, they find ways to sow political division in the United States by how they're characterizing this narrative. And so that's one area I'd like to dive into a little bit. But I don't want to let our time together go by without how you describe the capture of the useful idiot. And he jumps into this. Now, this is one individual in one story, but there are countless people, and not all of them are young people who don't know any better. We have some very well-heeled Ivy League graduates who do this same leap and become the pawn in this kind of a scheme as well. But talk a little bit about the Chinese government leadership level in your fictional account, which rings dangerously true to the truth, to how they saw an opportunity of political warfare, information warfare to their advantage, and then this cultivation of a young man who ended up being quite important to how this sprang back on the United States.
Right. Well, once again, I have to preface it by saying it's based on real life.
Yeah.
I've known a couple of people, younger people, who just became fascinated with China and the way that they do things. And of course, if you're in a university or even in one of those programs where you have expressed interest in Asia and China and would like to learn more, sometimes you get invited to China. All expenses paid. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll take care of you. And by the time they get there, they've already been indoctrinated. They've already been told, aren't you glad you're leaving this filthy, racist, horrible country called the United States? You're about to enter paradise, and we're going to show you a great time while you're here. Well, that may or may not be the case. They get moved around from one city to another. They get shown the sights. They get shown the philosophy behind the Chinese workforce, which is, it has to be admitted, it's beautiful if it was only true. And that is, you do your job, you pay attention, do as you're told, and you'll get ahead. Well, that's not what China is. But of course, for their guests from New Jersey or from Iowa or from Florida who couldn't get into the university they wanted to get into, who have been turned down for a job, who've been told you're not really very smart, who've been told by their parents, you're a big disappointment to us. China is a land of opportunity. And they come back from these trips, from these overseas junkets that they're on, and all they want to do is tell you how great China is. And they believe it. They really believe that China is the future. The character that I used in this book happens to have had early training in AI, in artificial intelligence. And of course, we're all talking about AI now and how it's going to change the world. But remember, China is light years ahead of us in AI research and development. And so this character went to China hoping to become part of the Chinese AI machine. And of course, you called it right, the useful idiot. What he was really being used for is to give them ideas about how America is weakening and how it can be used in China's favor and how America is really a terrible place and how do we exploit that for people. So that was his entry to China. You alluded lightly to a somewhat spicy part of the book. He falls in love with a Chinese interpreter, but that's not the crux of the book. The crux
Right.
is he came into China sure that he was going to see the future and going to see perfection, and instead of Valhalla, he maybe found himself in Gomorrah.
Well, I mean, there is this romantic notion of China that's been it's been a long-standing part of the cultural West's engagement with China. It was a part of the missionary impulse of Catholic missionaries going way back, Protestant missionaries that would follow the gospel of prosperity, if you will, in terms of entrepreneurship and free markets and trade would follow. And all of it came down to if only we could engage these people in a certain way. There's such opportunity. They have such a beautiful culture and history and a value on family. And if we could save those souls, if we could bring them into our marketplace, all of our problems would be smaller and more solvable. Risks and potential friction would be minimized. But there's been this impulse for several centuries, and I think it really accelerated in the last century. And so this, whether it was the physical romance or the romantic notion of I'm going to go there and do something big and merge with this great culture, this great people, and Chinese people, even under the Communist Party, can turn on the charm really, really well. And so he got more than he could have ever hoped for. So he thought, and so the romance part of it, I thought, actually had kind of a substantive undercurrent that was more than the tryst, kind of the spy versus spy honeypot trap, but. It was an interesting way of showing how people get pulled in. And your description just now was exactly right of what they've done with university students, business school students, people who have important grants or do interesting research or business development. That's their form of engagement. And we put it under the umbrella of the United Front, which is a somewhat euphemistic description of what is a very carnivorous intelligence and information gathering operation to capture elites and influence other populations. But let's talk a little bit about the leadership dynamics. I mean, you got into some of what what Xi Jinping's alleged reactions were going to be to all of this, and sort of where he was going with this. As you were writing this, forgive me if I'm remembering the timeline right. You're basically talking about the end of the Trump administration, maybe the very beginning of the Biden administration, but you're basically talking about the initial political reactions between leaders. But again, another one where it was really news heavy, what we were going through as Americans, whether we were consuming the news or talking on the news. But share a little bit about the arc of your story through that period, just in terms of how the leadership of China was trying to shape American opinion and to manipulate America's leadership.
Yeah, sure. 2020, I think, was a year unlike any other. Now, it's trendy to say that about any particular year, but imagine what happened, not just in America, but around the world. You had this pandemic that nobody knew how to cure. You had the pandemic before the vaccines were available. They were killing millions of people. And everyone was just looking around, and the reaction, the way to perhaps avoid dying from this pandemic, stay away from everyone. Get away. Don't come close to anybody, including your wife, your husband, your brother, your sister, your relatives, your kids. Put a mask on so we can't see your face and you can't make us sick. We won't let you get sick. It was the most dehumanizing advice for the entire world. And once again, who but the World Health Organization was out there saying, mask up, maybe put 2 masks on, maybe put 3 masks on. That'll be even better. And people just said, well, we don't know what else to do. So they're again, my favorite word, experts. We'll listen to them. And that was going on all through 2020. That was just one part of what was going on. In the United States, you also had this movement called Black Lives Matter that was becoming not just more noteworthy and newsworthy, but more violent and more demanding and more broad based in its view of what it wanted to accomplish in America, whether or not other Americans wanted it or not. And so we had the police being called criminals and calls for them to be defunded. How'd that work out, by the way, in Chicago? So we were a little bit worried about going out on the street, not just because of the pandemic, but because we might get killed. And then there was the presidential election of 2020, which makes a Ringling Brothers clown circus look more like a symphony orchestra. It was just without boundaries. It was without any class. It was without any taste. And it was largely without any true debate going on. You can shout at somebody and criticize their size or criticize their age or criticize the way they dress or their hair color. And those were becoming political talking points. And of course, the news media, the mainstream news media, followed along just like the good little poodles that they are. You want to say this at your speech today? Well, we'll devote 3 days to talking about what you said in that stupid speech. And so those three things, I think, that came together, the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the mendacity and stupidity of the presidential election that year, really created a framework for fallibility. We didn't know who to believe. We didn't know what to do. Most of our history is not like that. Most of American history has been bold actions. It's been people who have been educated, who are ready for a challenge, who believe in America and its ability to solve almost anything. And in the space of a couple of months, or over, let's say, the year, we lost all of that. We lost our confidence. We lost our belief in the future. We lost our belief in our own political system. We lost our caring for each other. So it was a heck of a year. I know everybody says that about every year, but and the Chinese from afar were watching all of this and saying, the Americans really are weak. There's a real opportunity for us here. And so the leadership, Xi Jinping and his cronies, began to devise, I think, a master plan for how to take down America, and they're doing it right now, as we speak. Most people don't understand that there's the Chinese social media sphere. We're talking now about TikTok and whether or not we should ban it in the United States. And China is saying, well, you shouldn't ban it. I mean, it has nothing to do with us. Look over here. There's nothing to see at the party level. It's just kids doing silly dance videos. Well, yes, but how does China handle its own social media? It has an amazingly strong apparatchik area called the Cyberspace Administration of China. And just as it uses CCTV to monitor eye movements and to tell you what people are thinking and whether they might be thinking something disloyal, the Cyberspace Administration looks at every single, I mean it, every single written communication online, and they analyze it. And if there's a word such as "I wonder if" or "the party says," then it's analyzed. And did you refer to the party in a respectful, supportive manner? You wondered what? Why are you using the word wonder? When these chat rooms first started chattering about the pandemic in Wuhan, the Cyberspace Administration of China came out with advice for how editors, which is to say censors, should handle those things. One of the most chilling pieces of advice that I heard was, and this is real, be sleek and silent when you censor something. Don't let anybody know what you're doing. Just do it quietly and move on. Nobody has time to look at that. It is the way the Chinese Communist Party does its business. It's the way it remains in such firm control. And I think that we, as we argue with each other and yell at members of Congress for wanting to take away our TikTok, well, that's a little bit like saying, take away our cancer, please.
Yeah. Well, this formula for fallibility, I think, is a very, very powerful notion that actually does come together in the book. I think it's a concept that we really need to face and grapple with in a very serious way as a country generally. Certainly, the US China competition, adversarial relationship, whatever anyone wants to call it. I sort of feel the way about Chinese political warfare, the way people talked about the war on terror after 9/11. The enemy had long ago declared war on us. We just had an awakening experience, and really the only choice for us is, are we going to respond and how? We didn't really get a choice about whether the war was underway. And the Communist Party of China has been at war from its civil war through its founding, through its Cultural Revolution, and has never really stopped being at war. And they've gotten a lot better at the subtle and stealthy stuff. And they've gotten wealthier and much more sophisticated and better equipped technology to do it. But the idea that AI could be used in a way to assess opportunity and then manipulate and shape opinion, not in your own country, but to effectively be able to do it against the world's greatest superpower. I don't really know that there's been a similar narrative spun, and you spun it, and it was true. It might be in a book of fiction, but it was true. And so whether you begin at the directions they gave to their own censors about how to talk about things internally, or you begin with the manipulation of the World Health Organization and talking through what we should do in response to this health emergency. But there is no weapon known to mankind that could have been as effective as unleashing this virus, its policy response, and the thought cancer that it generated. You get Americans dividing one another, undermining our key institutions. There are real health consequences. Some people have had this thing twice or three times, and there's going to be longstanding consequences. There are going to be consequences to the vaccines. There's a whole bunch that we're going to be dealing with for a very, very long time. And as we do that, we're not thinking about being on guard about the CCP, increasing our ability to compete with China, diversifying our dependency relationships with regard to China. So a lot of work that we need to do. And if America's stuck pointing fingers at each other and not pointing at who did this, and in case they wonder who did it, they can read it right here. They knew. Of course they knew. We know it came from China. They know it. We know it. I sure hope that people will engage this conversation. We'll take a look at the book. I didn't even have time, John, today to talk about the sequel. Hopefully you'll be kind enough to have a sequel to this conversation at some point when we can talk about the lessons that come forward in continuing that narrative. But I would be remiss if I didn't kind of allow a little bit of time here as we conclude to share a little bit about what you think we as a society, a polity, or even in the industry that you invested so much, the news industry, what should we be doing to turn this tide back in the right direction, given the nature of the threat that you've described?
Stop being afraid to offend someone. Say the truth. If somebody says you're a racist, say, really? I bet you are too. No matter what color they are, no matter what their sexual preferences are, no matter where they come from, no matter what their gender or what their supposed gender is, say what you think. Don't be afraid of being condemned. Don't be afraid of being criticized. With regard to China specifically, stop buying their crap. They sell us so many hundreds of billions of dollars of worthless goods that are meant to be useless in a couple of years. You know, there used to be a town in the state of Georgia, and it made 80% of the world's socks. That is out of business now. China now makes 97% of the entire world's socks. Now you can say, well, don't buy socks. Well, you kind of need socks when it gets cold, and to prevent foot rash. But don't buy Chinese ones. Try something else. Tell Apple, stop making your stuff in China. Take it to India, take it to the Philippines, take it to Vietnam, any place but China. You are hurting America. And for the numbskulls that are addicted to TikTok, get a life and find someplace else to shoot your videos. China is coming for us. As you said, they've already declared war. The only thing they haven't done is started shooting, and please God, I hope they don't. But they want Taiwan. They're going to take it. They send air balloons over our land and wonder why we're upset about it. And then when they start to have their jets going across the Taiwanese Strait, just to see if they're prepared, just to see what the reaction would be, we sit back and say, gee, I wish you wouldn't do that. Be a little tougher. Don't be afraid to say what you know is right. And that's the way to turn this around.
Well, John, I appreciate the advice and counsel. I hope people will take it. It's been an absolute pleasure talking through your book and the thought that went into it. I'm grateful that you got mad. A lot of the rest of us got mad too, but you did something about it and pulled it together. And I hope people will take that ride through the book and take the advice you had just now about, sort of man up, face it, deal with where we are. And yeah, we don't need to buy all that cheap crap. We can maybe make some cheap crap here and in other places. That would be a great way to kind of rebuild America back and maybe work with some people who don't hate us and don't want to poison us, whether it's with a virus or with fentanyl or whatever the case may be. But John, thank you for diving in on that and joining us here today at the China Desk podcast. I'll remind our audience, please watch our videos of each episode on the YouTube channel, and feel free to click that subscribe button and subscribe to the podcasts by audio on your preferred provider. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.